The town hall buzzed with energy, the air thick with the hum of conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. At the center of it all stood Donald Trump, commanding the room as he fielded questions about policies and leadership with his signature confidence. But as the next question loomed, the atmosphere shifted. From the sea of raised hands, a small, trembling voice broke through. "Mr. Trump," the little girl began, her tiny frame barely visible behind the microphone, clutching an old, worn Bible tightly to her chest. "Do you believe in God?" The room fell silent, the chatter evaporating as every eye turned toward her. Trump's expression softened, his usual bravado replaced by something quieter, almost vulnerable. In that moment, it wasn't just another question, it was the beginning of something far deeper. The room remained silent, the weight of Lily's question hanging in the air like an invisible force. The little girl stood there, her small frame barely reaching the microphone, yet her presence felt larger than life. She clutched the old Bible tightly against her chest, its worn leather cover a testament to the generations it had passed through. Her eyes, wide and searching, were fixed on Donald Trump, who stood motionless at the podium. For a man known for his quick responses and commanding tone, his silence was almost as striking as her question. Trump blinked, the faintest shift in his expression betraying his surprise. His gaze softened as he looked at her, taking in the sheer sincerity in her voice and the quiet courage it had taken for her to speak up. He placed both hands on the podium, leaning slightly forward as if to steady himself against the gravity of her words. The room, once bustling with the rustling of papers and muffled conversations, was now so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Lily's mother, seated in the second row, watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Her heart pounded as she saw Lily's trembling hands grip the Bible even tighter. This was the moment her daughter had been preparing for, rehearsing the question over and over during quiet evenings at home. She had told Lily, "If you truly believe in what you're asking, your voice will carry farther than you think." But now, as the moment unfolded, even she hadn't anticipated just how far. Trump finally straightened, his usual confidence tempered by an unfamiliar stillness. "That's a big question," he said, his voice lower than usual, carrying a weight that matched the moment. He paused again, glancing at the Bible in Lily's hands. The room collectively leaned forward, the air thick with anticipation. Even those who had come for policy talk and political promises now found themselves drawn into this deeply human moment. Lily shifted slightly, her small legs wobbling beneath her but refusing to give way. She didn't speak, her silence as resolute as her question had been. Trump's hand tightened on the edge of the podium, his expression shifting again, this time to something almost vulnerable. "I think," he began slowly, his voice measured, "that faith is one of those things we don't always understand even when we want to." The audience remained captivated, their eyes darting between the little girl and the man at the podium. It wasn't just the words being exchanged, it was the raw, unfiltered sincerity that had turned the hall into something sacred. Lily's question wasn't a challenge but an invitation, a chance for the man before her, and perhaps everyone in the room, to confront something deeper than politics or public persona. And for the first time in a long while, Trump seemed willing to accept. Trump's hand rested firmly on the edge of the podium as he took a deep breath, his eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to Lily. Her question had struck something deep within him, a chord he hadn't acknowledged in years. For a man so accustomed to delivering answers with confidence and authority, this felt different, raw, unguarded. He knew the room was waiting, but for once he didn't rush. "When I was about your age," he began, his voice unusually soft, "faith was something I didn't think much about. My parents made sure we went to church every Sunday, no exceptions. I remember sitting there in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering about everything the pastor talked about. Heaven, God, forgiveness. It all felt so big, so far away." The room, which had been filled with skepticism and casual curiosity earlier, now leaned into his words. The audience wasn't used to hearing Trump talk like this, not about policies or achievements, but about something so personal. Even the smallest movements in the room seemed to cease, as though everyone feared missing a single word. He let out a faint chuckle, his expression softening. I used to fidget during those long sermons. My dad would give me that look. You know, the one that says, behave or else. But I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I was just a kid, and I didn't understand. I'd look up at those windows and wonder if God was really up there, if he could hear me, or if I was just talking to myself. Lily's eyes were fixed on him, her small hands still clutching the old Bible tightly. Trump noticed the way she hung onto every word, her sincerity mirroring the questions he once had as a boy. He paused, glancing briefly at the audience, sensing their intrigue. My mom, he continued, his voice growing steadier. She used to tell me that God listens to everyone even when we don't think he does. She'd say, faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about trusting the ones you don't have. At the time, I didn't really understand what she meant. I thought faith was supposed to be easy, something you just had. But life doesn't work that way. The sincerity in his words rippled through the room, softening even the most skeptical faces. Trump's gaze drifted back to Lily, her wide eyes glistening under the fluorescent lights. Faith is personal, he said, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. It's not something someone else can give you. It's something you discover, sometimes in the hardest moments. Lily nodded slightly, as if his words had reached the part of her heart where her question had come from. Around her, the audience remained rapt, captivated by this rare glimpse into the private reflections of a man often seen as larger than life. It was as though her question had cracked open a door, and through it, a vulnerable truth was spilling out, touching everyone present. Trump's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the podium as he drew a steadying breath. The room remained silent, the weight of his previous words still settling in the air. His gaze lingered on Lily for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but carried an unmistakable depth. There was a time in my life, he began, when I thought I had everything figured out. Success, ambition, plans. I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could control everything. But life doesn't work that way. His eyes flicked toward the back of the room, as though searching for something unseen. My brother Fred, he said, his voice softening, was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a kind of goodness that I didn't always understand. Fred, he struggled, though. He had his own battles, his own demons, and no matter how much my family and I wanted to help, it wasn't enough. Lily's small hands gripped her Bible more tightly, her wide eyes shimmering as she listened. Around the room, the audience leaned in, captivated by this rare moment of vulnerability from a man so often defined by his confidence and control. Trump paused, his voice faltering slightly. When Fred passed away, it broke something in me. I was angry at him for leaving, angry at myself for not doing more, and angry at God. The last words hung heavily in the room, resonating with more than a few faces in the audience. Trump's expression grew somber, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. I remember thinking, he continued, if God is real, why would he let something like this happen? Why take someone like Fred, someone who had so much potential, who brought so much light, and leave me behind? His words, though personal, seemed to echo the unspoken questions of many in the room. The silence was almost deafening as the audience waited for what came next. For a long time after that, Trump admitted, I turned away from faith. I didn't want to believe in something that could feel so unfair, so cruel. I thought I didn't need it. But, he paused, his gaze returning to Lily, who now had tears silently streaming down her cheeks. One night, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I had a dream. Or maybe it was just a memory, I don't know. I saw Fred's face and he was smiling at me, that big goofy grin he always had. And I heard him say, don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do. Trump's voice grew steadier as he continued. That moment didn't erase my pain or give me all the answers, but it reminded me that faith isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting that even in our darkest moments there's something greater at work. Lily's tears flowed freely now, her small frame trembling as her mother gently placed a hand on her back. Around the room, others wiped their eyes, the raw emotion of Trump's story touching something deep within them. It wasn't just a story about loss. It was a story about finding purpose in the midst of pain, and it resonated with everyone present. Lily's small voice broke through the thick silence, trembling but clear. "My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds," she said, clutching her Bible tightly. Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound, and carried an unexpected weight that shifted the room's atmosphere. Everyone, including Trump, turned their full attention to her. Her innocence and courage, combined with the wisdom she had shared, left a palpable mark. Trump's expression softened further, and for a moment he just looked at her, as though processing the depth of what she had said. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman," he replied, his voice filled with a tenderness rarely seen. He straightened slightly, his hands resting lightly on the podium. "Faith is like planting seeds," he repeated, nodding. "I think she was absolutely right." He let the words settle for a moment, then began speaking again, this time with a steady rhythm that felt less like a speech and more like a conversation. "You don't always see the seeds grow right away. Sometimes they're buried deep, and it feels like nothing is happening. But they're there, beneath the surface, waiting for the right time to sprout." Around the room, heads nodded as the audience absorbed his words. It wasn't the polished rhetoric they had come expecting. It was raw and relatable, the kind of truth that felt deeply personal and universal all at once. People exchanged glances and whispers, their expressions softening as they reflected on the metaphor. Trump turned his focus back to Lily, his tone growing even gentler. "The thing about seeds," he said, "is that they don't grow because we demand them to. They grow when they're ready, when the soil and the conditions are right. And faith is the same way. It doesn't always show up when we want it to, but it grows when we nurture it, even if we don't see it right away." Lily's eyes glistened, but this time, she smiled faintly. Her mother squeezed her shoulder, whispering something that made her smile grow just a little more. Trump noticed the exchange, his gaze flickering with something close to admiration. He continued, his voice steady but carrying a newfound warmth. "And sometimes," he added, "that growth isn't for us to see at all. Sometimes the seeds we plant in others, the kindness, the love, the faith we share, those are the ones that grow in ways we never expected. Your question tonight," he said, looking directly at Lily, "is a seed. It's made all of us stop and think, maybe even plant a few seeds of our own." The audience murmured softly, the weight of his words settling over them. Strangers who had entered the room with polite nods now exchanged smiles, their shared experience breaking down barriers. Lily's small frame seemed to carry the enormity of the moment with quiet pride. What had started as a single question had blossomed into something much larger, a reflection on life, faith, and the simple yet profound ways they shape us all. As the weight of Trump's words settled into the room, a stillness lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that spoke volumes, of reflection, of connection, of something unspoken yet deeply felt. The audience, once composed of strangers, now seemed to share an invisible bond. People exchanged soft glances and murmured whispers, their expressions carrying the kind of introspection that only comes from hearing truths that resonate deeply. Trump looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. His usual commanding presence had given way to something softer, almost humble. "I want to thank you, Lily," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "Your question wasn't just for me. It was for all of us. You reminded us tonight of something we often forget. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about finding the courage to ask the questions that matter." The room erupted into soft applause, not the thunderous clapping of a rally, but the gentle, heartfelt kind that carried gratitude and respect. Lily, standing beside her mother, blushed slightly under the weight of the attention. She glanced at her mother, who smiled down at her with pride, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You did so well, sweetheart," her mother whispered, her hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder. Lily nodded, her small frame straightening as if bolstered by her mother's words. As the applause died down, people began to stir, but there was no rush to leave. Instead, groups of strangers formed organically, leaning toward one another to share quiet conversations. Some shared their own experiences with faith and loss, while others spoke of the questions they had never dared to voice. The atmosphere felt lighter, almost reverent, as if something profound had been left behind in the wake of Lily's courage. Lily turned to her mother, her voice soft but firm, the kind of voice that carried conviction beyond her years. Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she? Her mother nodded, her smile trembling with emotion. She would have been more than proud, Lily. She would have been amazed. Trump stepped down from the podium, making his way toward Lily. The crowd parted instinctively, their eyes following him as he approached the little girl who had shifted the course of the evening. He knelt slightly to meet her at eye level, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "Thank you, Lily," he said, extending his hand toward her. "You've got a wisdom about you that most adults can only dream of. Don't ever lose that." Lily reached out, her small hand shaking his firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump smiled faintly, standing again and turning to address the crowd one final time. "Faith," he said, his voice carrying across the hall, "isn't something we find alone. It's in moments like this, when we share, when we listen, when we dare to ask questions. Let's not forget that." As the crowd began to file out, the air buzzed not with politics, but with the hum of shared humanity. Lily's question had planted a seed, one that would linger long after the night ended. For everyone there, it wasn't just a town hall anymore. It was a reminder of the power of connection, the strength in vulnerability, and the courage it takes to ask the questions that truly matter.